I know, this is probably what you want to do, but today we're not talking about crit Sampo. Instead, I'll tell you everything you need to know so you can build the best Sampo for Kafka. Sampo's game plan is to apply as many wind shear stacks to his enemies as possible, and you should be able to maintain max stacks of 5 from his talents on each enemy. To put into perspective how strong his dot scaling is, at the highest trace level and max stacks, the total dot tick is 361% of Sampo's attack. So, how do we apply the dot when it only has a 65% base chance? His ult also has a 100% base chance to apply a dot vulnerability on each enemy hit, which increases their dot damage taken by a pretty good amount. I know a lot of you might be concerned with high effect resistant enemies and how that might cause them to be inconsistent, but the recommended effect hit rate you should aim to reach is 67%. It's like 66 point something, but we'll round it to that range. If you can get that minimum, then you can guarantee his ult landing the debuff on enemies with the highest effect resistance of 40%. Now, it doesn't guarantee that his talent wind shear stacks will land on everyone, but you'll see that all his attacks are multi-hit. So we started the battle with Sampo's attack, so you can see that his attack does not apply wind shear on battle start, which isn't a big deal. All of his attacks are multi-hit, so we're going to demonstrate that. His ult hits each enemy 4 times. Each hit has a chance to apply wind shear, and that applies to his basic and skill as well. So we can see the wind spawns are immune, of course, to wind shear, but we got 3 stacks on this one, 4 here, and 4 here. So you might have noticed that dot vulnerability also counts as a debuff, and dots do as well, and this is going to be really important for later when we talk about light cones. You might be wondering, if he hits so many times, then why do we need effect hit rate? Well, if we only factor the 18% effect hit rate he gets from traces, he won't even be landing his wind shear on elite bosses a third of the time. And not having 67% hit rate will not guarantee his ult debuff to land, which will hurt a ton. Okay, it's time to talk about light cones, and luckily for us, he's got some great options. If you have Good Night and Sleep Well, definitely use it. It's by far his best in slot. Maintaining 3 debuffs, you're going to have that up 100% of the time. His ult debuff counts as 1. All dots individually count as 1. So wind shear, shock from Kafka, you're going to have it. Don't worry about uptime. If you don't have this, there are some great alternatives with their own advantages. So Eyes of the Prey, his own light cone, it makes it so that he can use an attack percent body instead of effect hit rate, but it still falls far short of Good Night and Sleep Well. It's definitely a great option though, and I'm going to test them all on release of Kafka. For Mana, best free to play option. You get some break effect as well. You can get this to Superposition 5 by just buying it from the shop, and he does do a lot of weakness break, so he does break effect isn't a useless stat on Sampo, so don't feel bad at all for rolling break effect. Resolution Shines is a good wildcard pick, and you can actually increase your team's overall damage output by quite a bit more at the cost of his own personal damage, but it's still a good option if you want to use it. You can use Insistent Rain and Welt's signature, but honestly I just don't recommend using any of the 5 stars for his build in a Kafka team. I know I glanced over his traces at the beginning, but I wanted to give you a recommendation, especially if you're trying to save resources. You definitely want to go for his talent first because that's the one that his dot scales off of. So prioritize that and then go for his ultimate. It's still important, but talent first. As far as his basic and skill goes, they can increase his personal damage, but you don't even need to level them. His skill does have a really high multiplier though, with all the hits factored in, and especially with E1, the extra bounce, it's got a higher scaling than his dot tick when they're both at max level. I think it's like 370%, so a lot more personal damage if you invest in it, but if you're trying to save resources, it's not needed. His dots will do more in a Kafka team. For minor traces, definitely go for his attack percent and EHR traces. It doesn't hurt to get more, but you definitely want to be hitting that 67% effect hit rate threshold. For major traces, this one's not that useful because it already lasts for 3 turns, and extending it to 4 really isn't gonna do you much. This one though enables his 3-turn skill alt rotation. So if you do the quick math here, he gets 5 from using his ult, plus 10, so 15. And then with E1, so yeah, I am talking about E1, but most likely if you're pulling for Kafka, you will have E1 Sampo. That's just my assumption. It might not be true, but let's go off of that. You get 36 energy instead of 30 when you use a skill. So 36 plus 36 plus 36 is 108. Add 15, 123. And his ultimate has a 120 cost. So I'll be going over which teams can take advantage of his skill spam rotation, but just know that not every team will want him to. I'll try to keep relics pretty quick because it's straightforward. There are many options, but my recommendation is Twilight Line and Wild Wheat. Mix of 2, both of these increase the dot scaling. Space Sealing Station, no question, is best set. You can go for 4-piece Wild Wheat. You can go for 4-piece Twilight Line. You can also mix in 2-piece Hacker Space, but this is the general best build. For substats, you want to go for attack percent and speed. There aren't really any speed thresholds that you need to hit other than making sure he's faster than Kafka, because when he applies his dots, Kafka can proc them after. We'll go more into that when we look at teams. Other than that, break effect is not a bad stat on him. He does so much break damage with his skill that it's actually kind of viable, but again, you want to prioritize attack percent and speed. So let's look really quick at main stats. Effect hit rate, 100% is what you need. It does have a low drop rate. It's almost the same as crit rate and crit damage. So when you get a main stat effect hit rate, use it. Don't even worry about the substats. Main stats are the most important. Speed boots, no question. You need the speed, wind damage boost, and attack percent rope. He doesn't need energy regen rate or any other stat. It's attack percent. While Sampo doesn't need his Eidolons to function, he's got some pretty impactful ones, and he's on Kafka's banner, so hopefully he can get some of them. E1's extra skill bounce does a number of things. As I've mentioned, it enables the 3 skill alt rotation, since the skill will generate 36 energy instead of 30. Also increases his weakness break potential. The initial hit of his skill deals 30 toughness damage and 15 per each subsequent bounce. Since this has 5 bounces now, he'll be doing a total of 105 toughness damage per skill. E2 and E3 are the least notable ones here. E2 is a quality of life improvement, but again, with this build, you'll be able to maintain max stacks of wind shear on each enemy. E4 is stupidly good. It lets him manually detonate his dots on enemies provided they're at the max stacks, which with this build, again, will be very manageable. 8% of the dot's original damage per hit with 6 total hits from the skill will be 48%. This greatly increases his own damage contribution and makes his skill spam playstyle a lot more favorable. And it also increases the value of building him as a dot DPS. If there's only a single target on the field, you'll straight up just do an additional 48% of his total dot to that target. I like that characters with bounce can just shred single targets since their bounces all hit that one target. E5 is a nice bonus to his wind shear multiplier and vulnerability debuff. E6 increases his wind shear talent multiplier, which is of course really strong since dots will be doing the majority of his damage with this build. If we look at the current multiplier, 15% per stack is effectively a 25% increase to the base multiplier. So again, none of his Eidolons are necessary, but E4 being his best, E6, E1, and E5 all being very strong in Kafka dot teams. Although Kafka isn't released yet, I thought I'd show a couple teams. This is Kafka. Serval is the placeholder. You definitely want a solo sustain. They will generate all of the skill points for your team, or part of it at least. Bailu, Gepard, Natasha are good alternatives. Sampo and Kafka are here because this is a dot team. You definitely need 2 dot damage dealing characters. The synergy between them will be super strong. Even though we don't have Kafka's numbers just yet, Kafka's applying her own dots, and then she's able to manually detonate all your team's dots, just like Sampo's E4 detonates all his wind shears, but I'm sure it's going to be way stronger since she's a limited 5-star. Sampo will be Kafka's best partner because, again, you need a second dot character. Though we'll have to see how good Luca is on release, but I can guarantee you that Sampo will still be a top pick, so you're safe investing in him. For last slot, Asta is a good contender with her team-wide attack percent buff, which dots scale off of. Her speed increase will let you manually detonate more of your dots as well. I do want to note though that you will be using at least one skill per rotation, probably just one, on Asta. So Sampo won't be able to skill spam every turn, but that's okay because his basic hits 3 times, so 3 chances to apply his dot, and he can kind of just alternate. You definitely want to prioritize using skills on Kafka. My personal choice though for best in slot in the buffer role is Pela. I love Pela so much. So you can use Silverwolf, but what Pela does is she's able to 2-turn ult, which maintains her 40% def shred on all enemies, which dots do scale off of as well. But she does this all while basic attacking. So your healer and Pela, or your soul sustain and Pela, will be generating skill points, letting your Sampo and Kafka skill spam, which again, if Sampo is E4, this is huge and increases your output by a lot more. Now, the damage buff from getting the massive attack from Asta versus Pela's defense shred is roughly equal in terms of team damage, but Asta will increase your team's output by a lot more thanks to her speed buff, but they do have different advantages, of course, with Pela not needing to use skill points at all. Both great, if not the best options currently. Unfortunately, Kafka's not out yet, so we can't really test all the functionality and improvements she brings to a team like this, but there are some things that we can see from this fight. One, it's application of wind shear. We can see how many times they resist, but we can pretty much maintain 5 stacks all the time. Not pretty much, we do. As well as we can mimic Kafka's skill point usage by using Jingyuan, who's skill spamming, and then recovering those skill points with Pela and Lucha, which we can comfortably do so that both Kafka and Sampo can skill point spam. The other thing is looking at Sampo's weakness break, although the damage isn't the main focus here, because realistically, the Kafka instead of Jingyuan does not synergize with Sampo at all. If we use Kafka instead, this team would be doing, like, I'm not even kidding you, probably almost not double the damage, but something crazy. Even with an E6 Lucha, there's just so much missing from the manual detonations that we don't have, and just dots getting skyrocketed by Kafka being in the team that we are missing. So weakness break, I don't know if you've noticed, but that's one of the things we're looking at. Sampo is shredding these shields, like he is absolutely tearing them apart. So against win weak enemies, I think he'll be quite the menace, and it'll show you that break effect again is something that you shouldn't fear if you do get it. It's a nice to have, don't really need to go for it, but again, if you get it, it's good. So we're almost wrapping up here, especially if you consider that I don't have E4 and he's a solo dot character. I think he did quite respectably, even though he had E6 Lucha with him. I thought I'd show my Sampo build one last time in full. Again, I would never recommend a build that I myself wouldn't be using, and this is what I think will be his best build with Kafka. Speaking of which, good luck on your Kafka pulls. I hope you get her early, and I hope you get some Sampo Eidolons. I'm going to be going for all of these traces eventually and maxing out his talent, but right now, I don't have the resources. If you enjoyed, and if you found any of this information helpful, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know what your thoughts on his teams are, what you'll be running, and how you'll be building him. But with that being said, thank you again, and I will see you next time.